What I thought was this bold take over the summer is really starting to turn into a very obvious take the closer we get to kickoff between the Tennessee Volunteers and the Georgia Bulldogs. I think this is a very winnable game for Tennessee. It was one of the 10 wins I had circled on the calendar for Tennessee back over the summer, but maybe that just shows that it's aging well and I should appreciate that it's becoming a very obvious take. But Tennessee has looked a lot better through the first two games of the regular season over Georgia. That's partly what continues to influence my decision that I'm going to take Tennessee in this matchup. Of course, we know come game time, those two games, what do they matter? But if history has anything to do with it, these are the three areas where I think Tennessee absolutely needs to execute on for this to be a very winnable game and for the Volunteers to get their first home win in this series in like a decade. Let's get into it. I'm Paige Dauer. This is the Sports Page on Full Disclosure. My first take, maybe most obvious take, but it's the most crucial one potentially, especially on defense. Tennessee has got to protect the middle of the field. Of course, that comes on pass plays. Of course, that comes with how Georgia utilizes its tight end room. It also comes with what the quarterback does with their own legs. You could go to the meeting last season. Georgia's ability to regain the lead in that matchup was because Carson Beck had all the time in the world in the pocket. Then what happens? Kind of like a parting of the Red Sea. He scampers up the gap and then goes untouched into the end zone, and Georgia regains the lead, and that's kind of how the rest of the game went. And then you kind of looked at how the first two games for Georgia has looked this season and what Gunnar Stockton at quarterback has been able to give them. I think in this matchup, we'll see Gunnar Stockton utilizing his legs a lot, or at least being a run-heavy game for the Georgia Bulldogs. Not only does that put a ton of pressure on the defensive front for Tennessee, but it also puts a lot of stress on the linebacker unit, which is why I think how they've looked through the first two games is very telling with how good they could potentially look in this game against Georgia. Obviously, a lot of it has to be like, are you instinctive? Are you, really honed in on the P's and Q's of this game? And are you able to anticipate what you might see, right? That linebacker unit has a ton of experience, not only in this series, but in just SEC play. So kind of how are they growing from last year to now? Well, Arion Carter tells me it's in this kind of new wrinkle that speaks to their experience, that they're really kind of good at anticipating what might be called.
You got to anticipate plays before they happen. That's why film study is so important, preparation like I always talk about, and things of that nature, and just being able to go in with the mindset of having a game plan of what they like to do and how you want to stop it.
Now for me, I anticipate a run-heavy game because of maybe what we've seen through the first couple of games. And I know there's this whole idea about like not opening up the playbook. You don't want to expose too much about what you're going to run. But I think that kind of can be an indictment on how much or how little you trust your quarterback, because I would say Tennessee's been pretty open with their playbook when it comes to the quarterback play. They weren't really last year. And I think we all know that there's a lot more trust right now in Joey Aguilar through two games than maybe what they had in Nico Imaliaba. I think last year there was a lot more confidence in Carson Beck and what he could do versus what we've really seen from Gunnar Stockton through two games. So you could go to week one against Marshall. It was less than 200 yards through the air. Their longest pass went for 47 yards, which is not bad. But Gunnar Stockton was also the team's leading rusher, which is why I think we might see a little bit more of that in week three. Week two against Austin Peay. Of course, they had to deal with weather. So too did Tennessee against ETSU. But Gunnar Stockton's longest pass went for 19 yards. But again, maybe you could put that on the whole rain thing. I also find interesting that the tight end unit really hasn't been utilized the first two games of the regular season. Oscar Delp, who was a big player in the last matchup against Tennessee and Georgia, only has about like 3 catches for 33 some odd yards. So maybe that means they really use him in this week 3 matchup against Tennessee because they haven't through the first couple of weeks. Their receivers don't have maybe a little over 100 yards each so far. So it's been interesting to see how different the Georgia offense looks in this season, but maybe they get back to what we've seen in this matchup once they do get to Tennessee here in this game. But where I think this game could be won, especially protecting the middle of the field, are those late downs. I know if you paid attention or you are, a loyal listener here on Full Disclosure, you heard me talk about it earlier this week on an emphasis on 3rd and 4th downs. It's something we talked about on Live Ball with myself and PFL Todd Kelly Jr. that airs Friday mornings at 8:30. You could either watch us here on YouTube or join us in person at Harper Volkswagen. But we both put the squeeze on 3rd and 4th downs, and Tennessee being able to get better in both of those departments. They did against ETSU, and they might have good opportunities to get the Neyland effect in full force against Georgia, because against, I think it was Marshall, they were 3 of 16. Yeah, they were 6 of 16 on third downs and 3 of 3 on fourth down. So there's been a number of times where they put themselves in late down situations, and that will be a crucial opportunity for Tennessee to be able to get stops in those moments.
I'm VFL Chris Brown. Experience the VW brand proudly being produced in the great state of Tennessee. Harper Volkswagen is a proud partner of Tennessee Athletics. Go Vols!
Key number 2, viable options for Joey Aguilar. He absolutely needs a little bit of help in this game. And I think partly what led to double-digit interceptions in his last season at App State is because he didn't really have those viable options. He didn't have his best wide receivers. They didn't maybe utilize the tight end and running back room in the receiving game the way that they do at Tennessee. They're going to need to be able to have those options here against Georgia. The 6 drops through 2 games cannot be a trend that continues in this game. The balls that are on target have got to be caught. It cannot fall incomplete, because maybe against better teams like Georgia, those incomplete passes, maybe it's an interception when it goes right through the hands or it pops out of the hands and there's a defender in the area and they're able to go and make an athletic play. If there are interceptions in this game, I feel like it could be in scenarios like that where it's just like really unlucky for Tennessee, and not because he just throws it right to one of the defenders. We also dove into this on Monday, but ball security is a heavy emphasis for this team this week. Josh Heupel told me about it, on the Monday presser, about it really does kind of take everybody. Mike Matthews was like, I need to be better at finishing my blocks. Everybody has to be in sync and giving each other a chance. What I think will be interesting, though, is how often they go to Braylon Staley. Through the first 2 games of the regular season, there's been a couple of would-be touchdowns, if not for heavy contact and by the defender, and what the Vols probably would have hoped would have been a defensive pass interference that they did not get. I think there's a strong connection between Braylon Staley and Joey Aguilar. They've just not been able to connect on those explosive plays or on those intermediate throws that end up potentially being a touchdown. And I asked Braylon Staley earlier this week, I said, what are you doing to counteract that? Like, you might just not get that call despite there being a lot of contact, and maybe your hips are getting pulled down like they did against ETSU, where he wasn't able to get up high enough to get the catch. So I'm like, what are you doing to work through that? Because now that you're in SEC play, I don't see that stopping.
Indie drills, just incorporating like our interns holding us, going to make grabs. We got to just fight through it. It's the SEC. Some calls not going to get called. We got to play the next play.
If they can get some good physical play out of Braylon Staley, I wouldn't be surprised if that ends up becoming Joey Aguilar's go-to target. I know he's so good at spreading the wealth, and I think that's what will have the Georgia defense on its heels, because as I mentioned a number of times through the first 2 weeks, that first game, it was like 8 or so Vols. The second game, in one half, it was like 6 different Vols that Joey was able to get to. That puts a lot of stress on the Georgia defense, and we'll talk about why in just a second. But I also think, for Miles Kitselman, he needs to be a viable option. He had a drop last game. That really can't happen from your veteran players in these types of games. And if you go back to the last matchup where he, played with a lot of enthusiasm, if you remember, I think it was the opening touchdown of that game, and he's diving over the entire line of scrimmage, both his offensive line and the defensive line, to get into the end zone. That type of physicality and effort will absolutely be required. That will have to be the baseline effort that Tennessee gets out of its players for them to make this a very winnable game. So that brings me to my third and final point on how Tennessee gets a win at home and is 3-0 on the year. Joey Aguilar's composure will be massive. I think a couple of times, especially last season, where maybe you could go to that last drive, right? It's like under 2 minutes to go. It's 31-17. Tennessee's driving on offense, and what happens? A defender gets right past Lance Hurd. They get a hand on Nico Imaliapa. He tries to, escape the pressure. The ball gets knocked out loose. It's on the ground. Georgia recovers, ices Tennessee. What will be a difference in this game, and partly why I think we did not see Joey Aguilar rush at all in the game against ETSU, is for him to get comfortable being in the pocket, for him to be able to manipulate kind of a moving pocket where maybe it's not your perfect horseshoe shape, but how can you maybe step up in the pocket and still get a throw off before you decide to roll out or scramble or try to do something with your legs. I think part of that was a final tune up on those types of details and maybe what will allow him to get the ball down the field, give Tennessee a chance. Part of that will help him with his composure. And I think the team is a lot more confident because they take a lot of their confidence from Joey. They see how comfortable he is. They see how confident and in control he is. And his steadiness is a key factor, for how, the overall energy is of the offensive line and of the entire offense. And Sam Pendleton had a funny analogy to how he views his quarterback.
Just the amount of time he's been in the sport and the amount of I guess hours he puts into his craft just makes it even easier to play ball with him. He's uh, not a very not chaotic. He's always smooth, duck on water. He's there to pick you up when you're feeling down, and that's what we do in return.
What are your score predictions? I think I'm going to take Tennessee by a touchdown. I'm kind of thinking it might be 27-20 Tennessee, but regardless of what the final score is, I think Tennessee wins by a touchdown. Also, if you have questions for myself or VFL Todd Kelly Jr. that maybe you want to be answered during live ball, certainly leave that in the comments here or make those questions at our YouTube show on Friday and maybe we'll be able to get to it. If not, see us in person. That would always be very fun. But I'll be back later this week to talk more about Tennessee football and a couple of players I have my eyes out on. I'll talk to you guys then.